Hello, this is your science lesson, session 2. Your LC is Can I understand how animals are adapted to their environments? To start us off today, I would like you to think about the word adaptation. What do you think this means? We'll learn a little bit more about it later on in the lesson. Perhaps you could put a definition down in your book. What do you think it means? We'll come back to it later. Okay, and I do want to start us off as well with a couple of images here, just to put into your mind, and we will return back to these at the end of our lesson. Dutch elm disease. I won't say any more than that now. So, environment and habitats. What is an environment? What is a habitat? Well, all of your learning over time will have told you about different environments that animals and plants can live in, and different habitats that plants and animals can live in. Sometimes the words environment and habitat are used as though they have the same meaning. There are some important differences, though, however. A habitat refers to a specific area or place in which animals and plants can live. An environment contains many habitats and includes areas where there are both living and non living things. So a bird may live in the woods, its habitat, but its environment could include a stream and a mountain, which are habitats in their own right. And of course, streams and mountains are not living things as we would class them. What different types of habitats are there? Think about your learning throughout school. Well, we have polar regions, deserts, coniferous forests, tropical rainforests, oceans, grasslands, mountains, a heath. That's an unusual word. We don't come across that often. And remember, an environment is made up of more than one habitat, as we've already discussed. So what does adapted mean? Adaptation. Well, these three people are discussing it. The young person on the left says, adapted means to adjust to new conditions, like a new home or school. Young person in the middle says, adapted is when you turn a book into a TV program or a film. And the young person on the right says, adapted means making something suitable for a new purpose, like cutting off the legs of jeans to make them into shorts. Very fashionable. Who do you think's right? Well, actually, all three of them are right. But none of these is the scientific meaning. So, are you ready for a scientific definition here? Okay, it gets quite long. So if there's any time you need to pause the video, stop, take a moment, look out of the window, look at environments, look at a habitat, and then come back to it. That's fine. When you see a fish swimming in its habitat, it is noticeable that it's suited to it. Can you think of two ways that fish are suited to living in water? Also, some examples are it has gills to breathe in oxygen in the water. There's those slits we see down the side of the creature. It has fins that allow it to move through the water easily. And of course, you will have learned about streamlining when you learned about forces in year 5. It has a special bladder called the swim bladder, which allows it to remain buoyant. There's another word, buoyant. So it's easy to think that the fish has adapted, changed, to suit its habitat or environment, but this is incorrect. No living thing changes deliberately to adapt to an environment. Think about it. If you wanted to change and live in the sea, would you be able to choose to grow fins? If you were in the water long enough, would you start to develop gills? Of course, the answer to both is no. Even though it may seem hard to believe, this fish and all fish have developed all of these features accidentally, not intentionally or deliberately. The adaptations, each of which have occurred over time, which we call evolution, make it easier for the fish to live in water and survive. We only see the fish as it is now, and not the other fish who started off similar to it, but whose adaptations made it harder rather than easier to live in the water. And as a result, these fish have become extinct. So they're no longer living. The ones that had the adaptations have survived. The successful adaptations allowed the fish to survive in the water better, hence the fact that this fish is still alive now. So all of the ones that didn't have those adaptations, they've gone because they could no longer survive in that habitat. The ones that were left were the ones that had the adaptations needed. Adaptation is not a part of a living thing, it's actually a process. And the parts such as gills are called the adaptive traits. We've got loads of them, well, all of them as humans. The fact that I'm able to sit here and breathe in and breathe out is an adaptation, a successful adaptation. So this is the really, 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 really big science bit now. This you'll study a lot more of in secondary school, but I want to set you up ready for when you go to secondary school so you can blow your teachers away. How do these random accidental adaptations occur? Well, the usual cause is something called random mutations. And we need to go back to our DNA. That's a term you will have heard me use a number of times in class. You may have heard it when you see something on the news about science, often refers to DNA. Here's the science bit. Each cell, we've looked at cells, has a copy of the DNA. Random mutations, changes, occur when the cell becomes damaged and fails to repair itself completely. And sometimes this failure affects the DNA in the cell. In this situation, the DNA stays slightly different. And when the cell with the mutated DNA replicates, it'll replicate itself with the mutation. I hope you're still with me. But we have talked about this when we've learned about certain illnesses, such as cancer, for example, where there are mutations that happen and then those mutations go out of control. Mutations are not in themselves good or bad. Some mutations have no effect at all. However, other ones can cause us to lose or gain functions. And one of these is the example that I could give you right now is the ability of humans to drink milk after infanthood. So all other mammals stop drinking milk after they are weaned. And as they develop, they become what's called lactose intolerant. You may have heard that some humans are lactose intolerant. That means that you don't have the ability to digest milk. It can make you feel very poorly if you have milk, for example. Now, a mutation, a change in humans has allowed us to carry on drinking milk even after we are weaned as babies. So we don't have to have black tea or black coffee for the rest of our lives. And further mutation means that we can drink the milk of other mammals, such as cows, sheep, goats. Again, no other mammal does this. We do. So what habitats do humans live in? Are there any habitats that we're not able to live in? Can you identify any adaptive traits that humans have which enable them to live in such a range of different habitats and environments? Those are just some questions that I'd like to leave you with for a few minutes. I do go on to talk more in the video, so if you want to pause here and just take a moment just to reflect on what we've learned so far, it would be a good idea to do so now before I move on. Okay, back to Charles Darwin. There he is there on the left-hand side. We don't often see him as a younger man. We see him as an older man with a big bushy beard. Maybe that's just the image that we have in our head of what scientists are supposed to look like. But scientists come in all different types, males, females, people with different skin colors. And that's why we learn about different scientists in school as well. Everybody can be a scientist. Science is about investigating, finding things out, using facts, researching, changing things, looking at changes over time. There's so much involved in science, and anybody can do it. Anybody can be a scientist. So Charles Darwin and the HMS Beagle, which is the name of the ship, which he set out on his voyage around the world to investigate different living things. Here we can see in red his journey, and it's a very long journey, isn't it? He went around a number of different islands. Here, these islands are called the Galapagos Islands. And he did that in 1835. Maybe you can work out how old he was when he went on this trip, because there's his age underneath his name. So, this is Charles Darwin speaking now. I observed that there were lots of different types of finches, type of bird, and people believed that these were different species of birds that happened to have some similarities. So that's what people thought. They look different, different bird. Fair enough. However, I realized that these birds were varieties of the same species and that they were actually related. I thought that all the Galapagos finches had originated from one type of finch. The parents reproduced and created offspring, and these offspring would have varied. This is the theory he's forming in his head, what he thinks. In one part of the Galapagos Islands, bad weather affected the plants, and so only those with larger seeds were left. Those finches who had slightly larger beaks were able to eat these seeds, while those with smaller beaks could not. So very sad for the finches with the smaller beaks. The ones with the larger beaks, they're going to survive. So only the offspring with large beaks could break open and eat the larger seeds. Therefore, these offspring survived and the other smaller beaked offspring died. Survival of the fittest means those that are the most suited to their environment as a result of their inherited or adaptive traits survive, while others do not. That makes sense, doesn't it? The ones that are adapted will survive. And there's that word again from our last lesson, inherited. Things which you are given down from your parents through your, what we now know, DNA. Now, the Galapagos finches with large beaks reproduced and had offspring. So now you've got the male, the female, reproducing, both had large beaks, so their offspring will inherit large beaks too. Now, more of the offspring inherited large beaks and survived. In other parts of the Galapagos, smaller beaks ensured better survival than larger ones, larger eyes than smaller ones, for example. The adaptations caused by variation meant that over a long period of time, the Galapagos finches evolved adaptive traits that caused differences between them. This diagram shows how we can start off with two parent birds, or any creature, for example, and look how many are reproduced as a result. And these offspring would also have differed due to inherited and environmental factors. And so eventually, over time, stop resembling their common finch ancestors. So over time, these changes caused them to look different from their ancestors. No wonder people thought that they were different to begin with. They've evolved, but people didn't know what this was because Charles Darwin hadn't described the process yet. And as we know, he was a bit unsure as to whether to do this because he didn't know how the world would take it. It's a huge thing. Seems obvious to us now. But back then, it was a massive, massive thing that changed science. This process, evolution, where certain inherited traits allowed them to live and reproduce, while others became extinct, has a name. And it's called natural selection. Natural selection. Okay, so lots of science in there, lots of huge words. If you don't understand any of those terms, just ask me. I'm here to help you with it. Go back in the video, think back to your last lesson. But your task, what I've got for you are a number of different animals in your pack. Next to those animals are habitats. They're wrong. They're mixed up. Of course, they're mixed up. And then an adaptation that that animal has. Again, they're all mixed up. So, for example, the camel does not live in a coral reef. And the camel does not have white fur to enable it to camouflage itself in the snow. Of course, it doesn't. It's your job to rearrange them. Now, if you wish, you can cut and stick. That's fine by me if you want to. However, I would advise you, just to save yourself some time, Table. Organize it into a table. Animal, habitat, adaptation. As a challenge, then, once you've done this, this is quite straightforward. Perhaps you could go and find a different animal, investigate its habitat, and describe an adaptation that it has. If you think about the range of animals there are in the world, it's a quite straightforward task. It'd be easy to find, especially with the internet, to help you to research. If you have any books, whether that's in a classroom or a home, use those. If you have to use the internet, use the internet. Now, back to Dutch elm disease, just to finish off. So we've talked about adaptations in this lesson, changes over time. There was a type of tree called an elm tree, which was in this country for many years. It was native to this country. What happened was, accidentally, a type of fungus, which is a type of microorganism, which we learned about in our last topic, a type of fungus was brought in. This type of fungus was carried by a type of beetle, which was accidentally brought into the country. When the fungus got to the trees through the beetles, not the band, it affected the trees. Now, the trees just weren't ready for this type of fungus because they'd not adapted with it. This was a totally new thing. And so as a result, in the 1960s and 1970s, approximately 90%, that's 9/10, most of the elm trees in this country were wiped out. So we no longer have that tree in our country, in the countryside. So this is the kind of damage that can happen when certain, when things have not adapted or not come across a type of disease or a fungus or anything like that, and it's new to it. It can cause so much damage because that living thing has not adapted over time and does not understand how to live with this illness or disease or fungus or whatever it might be. And so as a result, those elm trees were wiped out in this country. They're not entirely extinct though, and there's some hope that we may be able to bring them back though. But that's just an example of how adaptation happens, or rather doesn't happen, in the real world. I'll see you on our next lesson. Goodbye.